welcome to our webinar. I'm Duncan Chapple. I'm hosting the webinar today, and I'm delighted to be here with Chad Huston. If we're lucky, our friend Rory Duncan is a little bit delayed today. So if we're lucky, he'll be joining us. But if not, I know you're going to be blown away by everything that Chad has to share with us. My role in the conversation today is basically being like a prosecution lawyer, carefully goading Chad with questions and inviting him to delve a little bit more into what he's found through his research method and what that exposes about opportunities for analyst firms to address things differently. As the moderator, I'll have a few other jobs. I've got to tell you that the webinar is being recorded. We're going to use it. I'm not sure how we'll use it, but we'll use it in some way. So that means that if you ask a question, we're going to try to be discreet. We're not going to flame you or use your last name unless we forget, because we want to be able to use as much of the content as we want. But if you are asking a question and you don't want that question to be used, then let us know and we will slice that up afterwards. And also, having mentioned questions, I should also say, for those of you who've never been in a webinar before and are not familiar with them, you can ask questions here. So up in the panel, at the top of the panel, there's a Q&A thing, and you can click on that and you can put in questions. And at a certain point, either at the end or if Chad's talk track takes him surprisingly close to your question, then I'm going to pull Chad in to speak to the question. And I'm delighted that Rory is now here, which is fantastic. I was scared that he would be a little bit late. I want to get straight through to the content as much as possible. So our speakers are going to introduce themselves, but what I want to do first, Chad, because really you're providing the meat in this sandwich, I kind of want to hand over to you and let you sort of introduce yourself and say something about why we're having this conversation today.
Yep. No, thank you very much, Duncan. So my name is Chad Huston. I'll just give you a little background on who I am and why I'm passionate about this market. So I actually started my career at Accenture. I've been in the IT services industry my entire career, and when I was at Accenture, I really loved building models, understanding the economics of this industry. Went and got my master's in economics, and then I worked for a market research firm called IDC for 10 years, where I was building the market forecast, building the market size, really building those core models that decision makers use as the source for their most important decisions. And I felt like, when I was making this research, one thing when you're an analyst, and if you've been an analyst, you've maybe felt this way too, is you sort of write this research and sometimes you sort of put it out into the world, right? And it's sort of like, how does this actually get used? So I wanted to go into the industry. I joined Capgemini, where I was in the strategy group there and really built a lot of the models and, advised the executives there. And through my whole career, there was one thing that always really kind of came out to me, which is I think there's a better way to do market forecast, market research, right? There's a better way. And so I left my job in February because I have a methodology that I'm really excited to share with you about, the ways that I think the IT services market and the forecasting, the market share, all that really core economic data can be leveraged in a better way. And so I'm happy to go through that as well. So before we get into it, I think Rory as well is going to be joining us. Rory, do you just want to take a couple of moments to introduce yourself?
I have to confess that Rory was in the webinar and then disappeared, which I think is the telltale sign of somebody who's not quite there, who's physically not quite in front of his laptop yet, and maybe was coming in from a phone. But just to give some context, Rory is like Chad, an IDC alumnus. You could say an IDC survivor. I don't know, but Rory is an IT industry veteran with, like myself, around 30 years experience in the tech vendor, who's been, on multiple sides of multiple desks when it comes to syndicated research. Back in the early 90s, he worked in product development, business development, market intelligence at firms like IBM and SAP and Adobe. But then for most of the last, in this decade, in this millennium, he's been working as an industry analyst and a consultant in firms like 451 and IDC, and then now for his own firm, Quick Tech Take. So Rory's somebody who's been a big part of our work at the analyst observatory at the University of Edinburgh Business School, which is led by our colleague Neil Pollock. And Rory, in fact, was speaking recently at our analyst relations forum at the university, which is in a way where the idea of this conversation developed. But then we were really keen to bring Chad in to talk through his discoveries. Chad, I'm gonna like give Rory a fanfare when he actually gets into the
Yeah.
conversation. But I see you've got your slides up. I think it'd be great if you could kind of jump into your findings and your methodology.
Mhm.
Maybe try to give a bit of an explanation about like why have you seen this a problem that you're trying to fix, I suppose.
Yeah. No, that's a good. I'll go ahead and kind of start and but I think you're totally right to bring up, right? Like, what is the problem that's really trying to be solved? I think ultimately it's about having that central version of the truth, which is what is the market actually growing at, right? Because a lot of people think, oh, this is, maybe I can just Google that to find what the IT services market is growing at. But, it actually involves a lot of really deep analysis and taxonomy, a lot of these things to develop something that you can really use as a rubric, right? Because what's the core question that's trying to be answered? How am I doing compared to the market? Right? Like if you're an executive for an IT services firm and maybe you're growing at 5%, is that good or is that bad? Right? I mean, you need to compare yourself to the market at all times, right? Because that is that metric to where you can say, okay, actually we're gaining market share or we're losing market share. You can't just look at that raw growth rate, in isolation. And then you can have some flavors of it, right, by the type of services market and by the type of region that you're in. But that's fundamentally, I think, the question that's trying to be solved is what is the true nature of what the market is growing at? So as we're getting into here, I wanted to talk about just some of the methodology for the Better Way Smart View. And really there's three major differentiating factors that I think traditional market research firms are not using that I think really could bring some innovation to this market and ultimately help you answer that question of what is the true market growth rate? What is the single version of the truth? So to start with, the first thing that is a differentiating factor is unstructured insight from the public internet. So I put this little word cloud up here, right? But if you think about all this information that exists out there, let's think about LinkedIn, for example, right? If you take the largest IT services vendor, Accenture has 700,000 employees. If you look on LinkedIn, they have 600,000 profiles. If you do detailed analysis of that, you can understand what country they're in, what types of skills that they have, what they're doing. And what's really important too is if you do that over enough time, you can start to see some of the changes in terms of how that workforce is moving from a regional perspective, as well as from the types of markets that they're participating in. Secondly, job postings, right? So if you go to Accenture.com, again, to use Accenture as an example, they have all these profiles. And if you do that over enough time, you can see where they're hiring people, the level that they're hiring people, the types of skills that they're hiring. Lastly, company's house information. So if you think about the UK, there's a thing called Companies House that requires vendors to produce an income statement to say how much money they're making in that country. Same with France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Australia. A lot of these countries require income statements to say that's how much money we're making in those countries. So if you think about that, you might be asking yourself, why is that information not already being leveraged by traditional market research firms? The answer to that is that it's unstructured. That information, it's not put into a nice little database where I can go to get that information. It has to be pulled from the internet. So first, right, Gen AI enabled data ingestion. Gen AI is fundamentally this new technology that enables us to gather all of that information, right? So you have all this unstructured information on the internet. Now we can gather it very easily. But secondly, you have to train it onto an ontology. So what do I mean by ontology? This is fundamentally the way that you define the market. So in the IT services context, right, this is consulting, outsourcing, right, business consulting, applications, infrastructure, all these different forms of the market, using that data and training it onto an ontology and using the same terminology for each vendor, right? Because what Accenture might use as their terminology might be different from a Capgemini, might be different from a TCS. And so you have to standardize all of that onto a single ontology. And then lastly is training and auditing it against financial statements. So if you're building a model for Accenture, again, for example, they have $64 billion a year. So you can leverage this information to say, okay, how much of that is going to be into the various regions or the various services markets that they talk about. And you have that information so that you're always training the model to really understand right? How those distributions are being used. So you're never using it as a way to actually produce the overall size of the revenue. You're using it to determine the splits of how you're doing it by region and how services market. So that's kind of the first differentiating factor that I think is something that's not being used in traditional market research, is that unstructured information that exists on the public internet. Now, the second differentiating factor is this concept of guidance-informed forecast creation. So if you look at the way that most market research vendors will do their forecasting, is they basically take a large, maybe 300 size survey, and they go out and survey a bunch of buyers and say, what are you going to be spending on IT services for the next year? Maybe they'll say 5%. So, okay, 5% is what they're going to be spending or increasing their budgets next year. So let's take that 5%, and then we're going to push it out 5 years and produce a 5-year forecast, right? So Duncan actually had a great point on this, and I've been using this ever since I heard him say this. But to me, this is biased because this is kind of like asking you how many times you're going to go to the gym next week, right? You're going to say, of course, I'm going to the gym 5 times next week, right? Because that's what you want to happen. So put yourself into the perspective of an IT services buyer. If an analyst firm comes and asks you, how much is your budget going to be increasing next year? You want your budget to be increasing. So you're going to say, yeah, it's going to be growing at 5%, right? You are a biased survey respondent from that perspective. And I think if you think about who is not a biased survey respondent, think about the CEOs themselves who have to give guidance to the market. So I checked 220 of the largest IT services vendors. Of that 220, 108 of them have CEOs that provide guidance on a quarterly basis, forecasting what their revenue is going to be looking like for some period in the future. Think about, so CEOs, if they go too high or go too low for a few quarters, they lose their job, right? So they are extremely incentivized to provide a very accurate number in terms of what they are expecting their business to grow at. And when you take a large enough sample size, right? So I tracked 220 of the largest IT services vendors. When you add up all the revenue, that's over $1 trillion in spending. You have a really good survey which can say, okay, here's what the market is actually going to be growing at. So this is kind of a change in methodology from using that buyer survey data, which can be biased because those people want to have their market increasing, to what are the CEOs actually providing for guidance as the way that we're forecasting the market. Now, this really just gives us a few quarters to look at in the future, right? We don't have that long-term 5-year forecast. But I think the world that we live in today, if you think about 5 years ago, right? Think about 2019, how different the world is from now. Is there really a lot of advantage to making assumptions to say 5 years in the future? I think you look 5 quarters in the future based upon that CEO guidance, and that's fundamentally a change to that methodology. And then last, the third differentiating factor is just the speed in which the data can be created, right? So I do all of my modeling in Python, which essentially means that it can be automated and produce these views on a much faster basis. So traditional market research firms really will just update based upon vendor models, maybe once a year, maybe twice a year. The analogy I like to use for this is kind of like getting onto an airplane and the pilot has wind speed and altitude that's 20 minutes delayed, right? You need to be making decisions upon real-time information, right? The same way I wouldn't get on that airplane. If I'm an IT services executive, I want to have the most accurate, up-to-date information on my dashboard about what the market is growing at, right? As an example, Accenture is going to be reporting earnings this Thursday, right? So they're going to report a revenue number and they're going to give guidance for the next 4 quarters. That is going to fundamentally impact the stock price of every single major IT services company because they are putting out information into the market to say, this is a change, this is new information. So if your IT services market forecast is not being updated based upon that new information, and if it's being delayed 6 months, 9 months before you're really getting that new view, again, it's like using that air and wind speed information from 20 minutes ago. You need to have that most up-to-date, accurate view of what the IT services market is growing at. So again, just to summarize, right, the 3 major differentiating factors: unstructured information that Gen AI enables us to use, guidance-informed forecast creation, which is a methodological difference, and then using up-to-date information, right, through automation to be able to produce that always up-to-date market forecast. Those are the really 3 differentiating factors that I think my model brings. And so I wanted to just take a moment here. I see Rory is I think back live, but Rory, I think we kind of talked about this, and you had some thoughts on this, and would love to kind of hear your perspective on some of the new methodological things.
Yeah, thanks, and apologies to everybody for being late. the lesson I learned was, do not try to integrate your Google Workspace calendar with Microsoft Teams before you're about to go on a webinar. So apologies, here I am. Yeah, Chad, thanks for that. And for those of you who don't necessarily know me, formerly with 451 Research and also IDC, I run a small boutique agency called Quick Tech Take. One of the things that Duncan and Chad and I talked about was, I guess looking more forensically at this, is particularly the methodology, especially some of the, the potential objections or reactions to this. And I think, Chad, I know you heard my view on AI, using Gen AI to farm some of this information, but also to look at things like social media profiles or LinkedIn profiles. I think we agreed that this is a really good start, right? As in it provides some really useful indicators that don't otherwise exist. Nobody's really kind of worked the data in that way, right? And having done a lot of survey-based work myself, you're absolutely right. Asking people what their intentions are often gives, slightly biased results, because people want to do a positive thing. Certainly that's one of the things I found. Differences between certain countries. Certain countries appear to be generally more optimistic. Respondents in other companies or other geographies tended to be a little bit more realistic. Some would say pessimistic. So I think it's important that these things are used as indicators. My own experience of predictions and forecasting would lead me to believe that, over time, this data will become more normalized and more accurate, because you're going to be looking at the differences between months and quarters and years. But you're absolutely right. Some of this, which I think has always been a bit of a dark art, influenced by, what are the clients going to say if we put them here, or what are they going to say if we don't have them there, needs a different approach. So yeah, as we talked about before, I think this is good. But some of those things I said perhaps are slightly overcritical. What have you done to mitigate those aspects?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're definitely right, right? I mean, this is, to me, my perspective was, this is kind of a base view, and you need to iterate over time, right? I think there's a great saying, right, that is the enemy of the good is perfect, or something like that, right? But you kind of have to go out and say, okay, let's start to get some of this stuff, because, and this is the great thing about Gen AI and machine learning, right, is that you use the data to make a prediction, right? And then, for example, I'm going to use Accenture as an example a lot, because they're like the largest IT services firm and they produce a lot of data, right? So it's always a good one to reference. But their geographies, right? So they produce a North America view, an EMEA view, and a growth markets view. So if I take all this data, feed the model, I can at least say, okay, predict what North America, Europe, and growth markets will be, right? So it creates a prediction. Okay, maybe it's within 5%, 10%. Now I move it to that exact number, because you're always going to tie to the financial statements. And then you've trained the model to basically say, hey, the model is, a little bit undercounting North America. It's a little overcounting Asia Pacific, right? It's a self-learning and self-referential model. And so that's kind of the one piece. I know another thing that we've talked a little bit about too is, right, these sort of ghost profiles and these ghost jobs, right? I know on LinkedIn, there's a lot of profiles for people that are, don't exist. Maybe they're bots. And then for job postings, right? You got a lot of ghost job postings. And that's a great question. I get this question a lot, right? Which is kind of how you're accounting for that. Without going to a ton of detail, really the idea is, for LinkedIn, you're always using this idea of a LinkedIn coefficient, which is, if you actually go, LinkedIn will publish their penetration in the major geographies. So like India, for example, India has like 100% of the people who work for that company will have a profile, in the sense of, like, if I go to a TCS, right, maybe they got 300,000 people that they publish and say they work in India. Well, that's how many profiles they have, right? So that would be like a LinkedIn coefficient of 1. Now, in comparison, Japan has a very low LinkedIn coefficient, right? So if I know, for example, like a Fujitsu, and I know they have 100,000 employees in Japan, maybe they only have 15,000 profiles. Well, they've got a coefficient of whatever would be 9. Basically, you have to multiply 9 by that 15K to get to that 100K. So what you're trying to get to is, what are the regional distributions of where these employees are? That's kind of the first adjustment. And then the second one is essentially like a GDP per capita estimation, which would basically say how much revenue is being generated by each person in that country. So again, to use the example of India, right? India is an offshore location, so there's very little revenue being generated for India itself, right? It's being generated in the UK, the US, right? And so they're going to have a very low coefficient in terms of that GDP being how much revenue is being generated per person in India. Compare that with like Switzerland, for example, right? So Switzerland is a place where you have very few onshore people, right? But the people who are onshore are generating a lot of revenue. And I think the key insight to understand is that that coefficient is very consistent across multiple companies. So when you have that large training set, you can start to see, okay, right? India has this coefficient, Switzerland has this coefficient, and that's the same for TCS, it's the same for Accenture, it's the same for Capgemini, right? Within reason, right? It sort of has like a 5 or 10% band. And you can see that over 220 vendors, right? You start to get a really powerful methodology that can handle that. And then just for the job postings, right? I only pull primary research. So I only look at the job postings on the actual company, right? Like Capgemini careers or TCS careers or Intis data careers, right? Because if you go on LinkedIn, for example, right, you're going to find multiple jobs being posted multiple times, right? If you go to an Indeed, you're going to have the same problem. So it's kind of that traditional research idea of primary source, right? You have to go to the primary source. And if you stand at the primary source, again, if you look at it over time, you can start to get some, metrics that I think are really useful in terms of, okay, have they started hiring a bunch of people? Where are they hiring people? What types of skills they are? But, it's a work in progress. And this methodology, right? I say better way because I take that to myself, right? Which is there's a better way for me to always be doing this and just want to iterate on that process. So it's certainly something to think about. Yeah.
No, I think you've explained that really well, Chad, and it's good that you do have a lot of the self-reflection built in, and ways to try and validate it. I don't know. There's much more you can do at this stage, but as you get more data back, you'll be able to refine it and refine the sources. So, yeah, I think you've done a really good job at figuring out how to try to validate some of this without making too many assumptions. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think humility is always something, to keep in this market, and openness, right? Almost open source, right? What are the assumptions that are being made? Because I think that's something that's kind of been missing from this market to some degree, right? It's not this, hey, we're the experts, here's your model, right? It's here's how we built this, here's the assumptions, let's have a conversation together about that. I wanted to move on to the next piece because I think this is really the most powerful story of what the model really brings, which is what is the actual data saying? So I'm going to start here. And again, I just want to reiterate, I take the income statements from 220 of the largest IT services vendors. So you think about Accenture with 64 billion, Deloitte with 30 billion, TCS with 29 billion, IBM, with 28 billion. If you take 220 of the largest and you add up all that revenue, the annual spending would be 1,026 billion. So this is a pretty substantial size of the global economy, but certainly a very good understanding of what's going on in the IT services market. And so I pull that data quarterly and I look at it in constant currency. And so if you see this first little line that's coming up here, what is this saying? So when I first did this model, it was with actuals as of December of 2023. So you can see it says actuals calendar year 23, quarter 4. So this was basically saying this was what the market was growing at when we had the information as of December. And what was happening, if you follow the IT services market, this is probably a familiar story, which was, back in 2022, the market was just growing gangbusters, right? 12% growth, double digit. Everyone was growing really fast. It was, kind of that catch up from COVID. And then we've seen consistent decline every single quarter starting in the third quarter of 2022. And again, we had actuals up to the fourth quarter of 2023. And then we used that guidance informed forecast, right? So the CEOs were saying, hey, Q1, we're going to return to growth and we're going to see increasing growth into the third quarter of 2024. Well, the power of the model is we had another view, which was the actuals that were for the first quarter of 2024. So this is the actuals that were as of the end of March of 2024, so the first quarter. What did we see? Well, we saw that, unfortunately, we saw another decelerating growth of services revenue growth, right? So Q4 was not the bottom. Q1 was additional declining services growth. And then if we look at the forecast, again, the CEOs were out there saying, hey, we think we're very close to the bottom. we're going to see increasing services growth from here on out. We got a little bit of a longer tail because, again, I'm always looking at the guidance that the CEOs are providing, right? So we got some further insight and saw that, the market's going to continue to grow out to the first quarter of 2025. Now, here's the cool part. I'm about to publish tomorrow the next iteration of this model, which is actuals as up to June of 2024. So this is people who have reported for the second quarter of 2024. And what did we see? I think the headline there at the top says it great, right? The IT services market strikes back. We have now, first quarter was the bottom. We have now returned to growth in the second quarter of 2024. Now, I read through all the earnings calls for the major IT services vendors. And if you look at what the analysts are asking on those calls, every single one of them is saying, when have we reached the bottom? When is the bottom of this market? When are we going to stop seeing this deceleration? This is the answer. This is the model that can answer that question, because we look at 220 vendors and their income statements and can see in constant currency, oh, actually, the first quarter was the bottom, and the second quarter, we have returned to growth. And again, we get that forecast. So actually, we even saw a little bit of an increase that we're expecting in that third quarter. And moving out into the rest of the forecast period, seeing really good growth. So I think this says a couple of things, right? Number one, I think it shows the power of that guidance-informed forecast, because we're looking at what the expectations were, and then we're going back and looking at it, right, and saying how close were we to our actual predictions. I would ask if you ask traditional market research firms to go and compare themselves to the predictions that they did previously, see what their answer is, because I think from my perspective, it's always important to say, hey, we forecasted this, and this is how we actually did in comparison to that, right? And you can see that dotted line, right? Now, again, back in, when Q4 was reported, everybody was saying Q1 was going to be, another quarter of growth. That wasn't correct, right? But at least we can see that now, okay, we returned to growth here in the second quarter. And so I think that just kind of shows the overall, power of the model. So I'll kind of stop here. I know, Duncan, you had some questions maybe about some of this.
Yeah, I mean, I had a few thoughts and a few comments on that. I mean, just to hook on it, well, one thing that was really interesting was like a bit ago, you were saying, what happens if you kind of look back at the forecast of industry analysts, and it's kind of interesting that hardly anybody does that. Industry analysts themselves, of course, they're aware of how their models are changing, but often they won't highlight when their models are changing. And I can even think back to there are some famous tech industry causes célèbres, like when IBM made fun of IDC for the way that its titanium forecasts were completely out in exactly the same way every year. And it was like every year IDC was forecasting an explosion in titanium growth, and it just kept on never happening. So they had this like hockey stick, and it just kept on being reprinted year after year after year. But what's interesting is that with financial data, like this does matter. And I remember posting, I think back in April, March, April, there was a day when Gartner and Forrester both released quarterly results within like 24 hours of each other. And Gartner's results were better and Forrester's results weren't so good. But what was interesting was that Forrester's results were really in line with the expectations they set for the market, whereas Gartner's results were out there, were actually much better than expected. And if you look at what their stock prices did, Forrester's stock price went up because they were delivering on expectations. And even though Gartner's results were better, the market punished Gartner's share price because the forecasts were out of line with what they delivered. And the market rewards predictability. So it's so interesting that if you interact with tech firms on the investor relations side, they are doing their very best to be as accurate as possible. Whereas when you interact with them on the analyst relations side, maybe we're a little bit optimistic. Maybe there's a certain amount of puffery and suggesting that things are always a little bit more optimistic. Markets are going to be a little bit hotter than they are. And as you say, Chad, I mean, that's absolutely the case with buyers. Buyers never want to say that next year that their budgets will go down. They're the last people to know when that happens. And the more that that there's a collective interest among buyers in making budgets seem like they're growing. But I just wanted to come back to something that I think it would be too easy for us to skip over, which is this really substantial discrepancy between these data. I'm pointing over here because I've got your slides on the bigger screen though. They won't be over there for everyone else. But the discrepancy between your data and what the mainstream industry analyst firms are saying, they're not only working on intent data, but there is such a strong positive bias. I mean, they are 200, 250 basis points up on reality almost all the time. I mean, I may be wrong, but that's my that's my perception. And even with the very largest organizations, which should have the more access to data than you have, they're just they're way out, way out, and nobody punishes them for this. And so I also wonder if this says something about the built-in bias of the customer. So of course some customers want real data, but other customers, it seems that maybe there are some customers who would pay more for data that had a strong positive bias in and overstated the rate of growth in the market. Yeah, that's that. I mean, that's too many points to be understandable. But I wonder if you want to maybe just comment on this discrepancy between these publicly available observable data. It's relatively straightforward to crowdsource them. Well, it's not super straightforward, but somebody with Gartner or IDC's resources could also do what you were doing. And yet they're not doing that, and they're producing data that are substantially dislocated from reality. How do you account for that?
Yeah, no, I mean, Duncan, great points. And, something that, I think why I'm kind of passionate about this, right, is I've seen a lot of this stuff. And, fundamentally, my perspective is I'm just about the data, right? Like, I try to remove as much of my opinion from this and focus totally on the audited income statements, right? Because if you have an auditor and they say that your revenue is this much, right, that's the number. And so, I'll give you just a perspective on why I think we see a few of this discrepancy. And I know I would love to hear Rory's perspective on this as well, because it's something that he's experienced. But, so number one, I think is the fundamental idea of what is the use case? I mean, there's this thing that I love, which is, do you like, comforting lies or harsh reality, right? It's sort of a very human question that I think we hear in a lot of our perspectives, right? But, look at these graphs. I mean, you can think, depending on your use case, you might want to have a different one, right? Like if you're trying to go out and get money from investors, you're just going to want to have the fastest growing, largest market that you can find, right? And there's no shortage of people who will produce that type of research, who will say, Gen AI, for example, Gen AI is going to be $1 trillion market and it's growing at 100%. You can go out on the market and you can find a lot of that, and it's kind of no problem finding that. And so there's certainly a use for that. And I think that could be a bias, but my perspective is I think there's another use case for this, which is what are you actually benchmarking yourself against? Because fundamentally, you have to say, again, okay, maybe I'm growing at 5%. Is that good or is that bad? I need to have a market number that is defensible to say, okay, I'm actually gaining market share or I'm losing market share. And so I think a lot of it depends on the use case, right? And so when you're doing more of the corporate strategy and when you're doing more of the benchmarking of your employees and your salespeople, I think that's when you're going to want to really have that core data, which is, the truth and reality. If you're going out to an investor, right, maybe you don't care so much about what reality is. Maybe you care more about, okay, can I have a name brand that I can put out there that says that I have a huge market and it's going to be fast growing? So I think number one, it comes to the use case. And my use case is fundamentally about the truth, right? What do the actual audited financial statements say? I think secondly, there's this idea of taxonomy within organizations as well, right? Because if you think about what do analysts want to cover, they all want to cover the cool, new, sexy, piece of the market, right? They want to cover Gen AI. They want to cover cybersecurity. And so there's this idea that, they're going to want to have their piece of the market, which is, the cool piece, and that's going to be a really fast growing market. And so there's this tendency to overcount, these certain parts of the taxonomy and then not be taking maybe the slower growing parts to have that, full view of the market. And then you sort of get this taxonomy battles, right? That can be kind of complicating to that. And I know, Rory, that's something that you've talked about, and I would love to hear your perspective as well on, some of those taxonomy issues that you've seen.
Yeah, so and if there's any other analysts on the call, sorry, my cat is just going out. There are various opposing forces, and if the question is about what the analyst firms do or don't do, you always have these opposing forces because you have many different analysts with their views on the market, some specialists, some generalists. You've then got all the clients with their views on the market. And forecasting is one of these triggering items that always creates issues if you have clients who are paying for forecasting, particularly because the expectation is that there's going to be some positive benefit from it. Nobody likes bad news, but at the same time, there are some folk within certain clients who want to hear it, but most generally don't. So that creates a situation where whoever is the team looking at forecasting has to try and figure out what is that end result going to be. And to your point, Chad, rather than what is the technology supplier or end user thinking would it be used for? For example, setting salary or bonus expectations or whatever. For the analyst firms, they have to figure out what's going to be the end process of this. If we are consistently forecasting a number X and a number of our clients really disagree with that, that potentially will mean, lost clients, lost business, or it will embroil you within, many hours of negative client feedback or negotiation or whatever. Fine. That's a difficult one to do. And certainly I've been in the situation where we have these team discussions about, how we should look at where the market's going. The second part is then how it's counted. And this is often one of the kind of get out clauses that analyst firms can legitimately use, because it's very rare that the analyst firms looking at this forecasting will include exactly the same things that all of their clients in a particular sector are looking at. Each company measures things in a different way, includes certain things in their, let's say, total addressable market, excludes things in their total addressable market. So most of the situations I've been in where there have been disputes are generally down to the fact that analyst firms are including things in their forecasting that others are not, or are double counting sometimes some aspects that clients would not include in their forecast. So typically there are ways around that. The second point that you asked me about was this the war of the taxonomies, which this is, I guess, part of being an analyst in a large analyst firm, where you do have people who are wanting to work on certain developing areas of the market. Now, if you're in the cloud space, then you might want to look more at cloud security or AI enabling cloud, whatever. But the AI analysts or the security analysts would see that as kind of encroachment, right? So their taxonomy would not include certain parts. I know, looking at services, for example, I had an argument with a colleague who basically was saying that, data services are not services, it's data. You're looking at everything as a service. I said, well, yeah, data as a service is a thing. So you can get into these arguments, which means that you've got taxonomies that are being created that often will include parts of others. And therefore you get to a situation where you're creating these forecasts that things aren't quite right. So often you have to kind of take a step back and look at it as a whole, in this same way. And I know, Chad, you and I had this discussion about what you are including and not including. In many ways, it's best to take a step back and include everything where you can, because the more specific you get about sectors of the market, the more kind of murky it becomes, I think.
Yeah. No, I mean, great points that you're bringing up there. And, just while you brought up that one, right, about what's being included, I think this is totally true. And there's this phrase that I like to use, which is market size without market share is just an opinion.
Yeah.
But what I mean by that is, if you ever see a market size that's being published, you should always be able to ask the analyst and say, okay, what are the audited revenues that are behind that number? Because if someone says, oh, this market is, $100 billion, and you ask, okay, what's the market share? Well, we haven't done the market share, right? We just did a, demand side view. That's ultimately just survey data that you're estimating what you're spending it on, right? And so, I think that's one of the powers of this methodology is you can go through those 220 vendors and by the way, I tagged them by 10 different archetypes, but you can say, okay, this is my actual total addressable market, right? I compete against this vendor, this vendor, this vendor. Okay, this vendor, maybe they're industry specific, maybe they only do government work, or maybe they only do financial services, and I don't do that. So I'm not going to include them. Or maybe, they're mostly just in Japan, so I'm going to exclude them. It really enables you to go through and sort of customize your total addressable market based upon the vendor that's in there, right? And so I think that in some ways kind of, is at least a methodology to try to alleviate some of those taxonomy problems, because you're not just taking the opinion of how someone interpreted a financial statement. You essentially have access to that financial statement, right? And you can say, okay, that's what we're going to include or what we're not going to include. So absolutely.
Where they're public companies and they make those financial statements. But obviously, I know you've caveated that.
Yeah. I see, Duncan, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to chip in, and also I see a question in the Q&A from Robert, but I kind of wanted to ask about firstly, this thing of double counting, right? I find this absolutely infuriating. The idea that you might have that you could have an industry analyst firm that is building a taxonomy of the market as a whole, and it doesn't make a taxonomy that is, collectively inclusive, but where every element is mutually exclusive. That seems to me to be the absolutely essential, elementary, childlike fundamental of building a market taxonomy. And the fact that people don't do that means that you inevitably end up either double counting or having like large amounts of white space. And kind of, Robert's question, it kind of hits the validity of that. How do you define IT services? I mean, I know, Rob, that you have got like you're building it bottom up, aren't you? You've got, specific companies, they've got particular revenue lines. You're segmenting their revenue between these revenue lines, and then these perfect. You've got these 9 boxes that roll up, and as far as possible, every dollar is in only one of these boxes. So I think one question is like, how can it be that we are tolerating this situation where we've got market forecasts that are that don't add up, literally that don't add up. And then the other thing is like, what are the long-term implications? I mean, you are, as far as I know, the only person who is using this, bottom-up, tech-driven approach to elicit real numbers from what companies are telling the street, and then you're using that to build something out. But like long term, how can anyone defend these legacy approaches, which are way out from reality, year after year after year, they're way out, and they don't. I mean, like they don't add up. Isn't it weird? Isn't it weird, in fact, that these legacy approaches still exist? What's happening?
Yeah, it's a great question. To me, I think this, if you look at where it comes from, because Wall Street actually kind of works the same way. And what I mean by that is, like, I remember when we first started covering the cloud market, this was maybe around 2011, 2012. And so the question from all the Wall Street analysts would be, what percentage of your revenue is cloud? And you can think about, for most large technology organizations, that's actually like a really complicated question to answer, because it makes you have a determination about what is cloud versus what is not cloud. And there's always going to be blurry little lines between how we tag something and how we don't. And so ultimately what people realized is my stock price is going to increase the most if I give them the largest number. So they would basically go through their CRM system and say, is this a deal? Could I in any way make an argument to say that this is somewhat related to cloud, right? I mean, maybe this could be like, a huge application development contract, but there's some little piece of it where you're building in cloud access. Okay, let's just count it as cloud, right? And add all that up, and we want to give the biggest number possible. So I think that's, to me, maybe culturally where some of this came from, because Wall Street's kind of always operated right that. And you see this now, by the way, with Gen AI. Like, at least from an IT services perspective, every single company now says, here's what our Gen AI number is, right? It's $1 billion a year. And what are they doing? They're basically taking anything that you could even make a reasonable argument to say that is a Gen AI number and that's a Gen AI number. So I think I call this tagging, this idea of just tagging things, right? Because ultimately the stock price gets rewarded and it becomes this culture of, okay, well, analyst firms kind of will operate the same way, right? Which is I will get rewarded with people will buy my research if I, essentially are tagging these kind of cool new parts of the market. I think that's, as far as an explanatory factor for why it's come to this point, I think that's why we're here. But I think ultimately, and this is why I'm passionate about this is, this is a lot of work to build these, take 220 financial statements and be putting these on a quarterly basis. And so this is kind of a new, almost like a way to audit that, to say, okay, here's the truth, right? And I think there's another thing that Rory brought up, which is really important in terms of, why there's not this, auditing, looking historically of what analyst firms have shown and changing that. And that is because salespeople many times have their bonuses based upon some of the data that gets produced by analyst firms. So if I'm a salesperson at, maybe HPE, the data that is produced by an analyst house, right, that gets fed into their CRM system, and then their bonuses are based upon that, right? Here becomes the problem. Once that has been done, there's extreme hesitancy to change, because what if I'm a salesperson and maybe my bonus is less than I thought, and then the forecast gets changed, right, historically, retroactively, and all of a sudden I'm saying, hey, you used that to calculate my bonus, and actually it was incorrect, right? So that's, I think, one of the historical reasons as well as why there's not always wanted to be these changes, because if they're basing it on sales performances, once it's sort of set in stone, okay, we really don't want to change that, because then we have to go back and unwind all these bonuses, and that's going to be this political thing, right? So the hesitancy to kind of go back and audit this stuff, I think that's been some of the historical kind of reasons why. I don't know. That's just a few thoughts, that sort of came out as I was, kind of thinking about what you were saying.
Can I try and bring Rory in on this? I mean, Rory, you can tell I'm, extremely annoyed by this phenomenon, but it's existed for generations, and it's going to presumably continue to exist. And there. So for you, as somebody who's worked, at a very senior level, not only inside analyst firms, but obviously with their clients and stakeholders, how do analyst firms navigate this balance between, should we say, optimism and realism? There are stakeholders, like in the company that I'm working with at the moment. There's a corporate strategy team who are responsible for M&As, and they really need super accurate, dispassionate numbers, right? I mean, they are they are not interested in the sunny side, in walking on the sunny side of the streets, right? They're looking for real numbers. But of course, there are lots of people who want, for example, the biggest possible total addressable market. How do organizations navigate that? And also, I'm looking at the clock, and also I know that also, Chad, you wanted to make, you had some thematic points to pull out from the most recent announcements to show what else is buried, apart from the revenue trend. What else is buried in this insight that we're all overlooking?
Yeah. So I know we're already sort of at 50 after. So yeah, I think we can kind of maybe close out on this, and then I'll try to get through this quickly, and then maybe have some final thoughts. But so, another thing that I do is I go through the earnings calls for all of the major IT services vendors and really look at what are the CEOs themselves saying. Because you can't just look at the raw guidance of what they're providing. You have to have the context of like what they're actually talking about. And this is something I like to do every quarter, which is one of the key themes that's really kind of coming out within IT services. And I'd love to, just kind of share this, because I think this is kind of that qualitative view, right? We have that quantitative view, which is all the charts, and that's always great, but you always want to have that qualitative view as well. So the number one word that is said more than anything in any of the earnings calls is discretionary spending is down. I think every single CEO has said the word discretionary spending in their earnings call, and not in a positive way. So what does discretionary spending mean? This is essentially just that spending that has not already been allocated. This is more, from the services perspective, this is more of that consultative type stuff, which is, hey, we have something that we're wanting to change, right? So let's spend some money to try to change that. That spending is down. most of the spending is just on, we're going to keep things steady state, right? We have this architecture, we have this application, whatever, we're going to keep it in its current state. But this change, this discretionary spending has come way down. And that is the number one thing that we hear more than anything. Now, secondly, what's the second most common thing that you hear is cost efficiency is the name of the game. What do we mean by this? I think this is really to do with the change in the interest rate environment. If you think about it, we've had low interest rates, at least in the US and Western Europe, for the past 10 years. Think about all of the new technologies that have come out with IT services, right? You've had cloud, you've had some of the CX and interactive type of stuff, have Gen AI coming out now, but all of that stuff has existed in a low interest rate environment. So it's always been, hey, if I need to do a cloud transformation, I can borrow money at essentially 0% in 2 or 3 years, and I'm going to have a new cloud transformation and I get the benefits. All of a sudden, the interest rate environment is now, okay, money's no longer free to borrow. It's actually kind of expensive to borrow. So that's changed the sales process fundamentally from an IT services perspective. So how do you sell deals? Here's how you're going to make money in day one, right? This is not 2 or 3 years down the line, we're going to give you this new capability and you're going to get this. This is, I want to sign this contract and I want to, so it's about cost saving at the very beginning, right? And I think this is interesting because we did see the rate cut last week, right, in the US. But I think this idea that we're going to go back to a low interest rate environment is unlikely, right? Even if interest rates are lower from where they are right now, they're not going to go back to that really low level that they are. So I think this is just kind of a fundamental change in the overall sales cycle within IT services. Now, there are some market segments that are winning. Supply chain, spending around supply chains are still strained. So helping people to develop their supply chain was mentioned many times. That cloud modernization and application rationalization, seeing a lot of spending on that. Vendor consolidation, right? Again, this is kind of that cost saving piece, but I want to work with fewer vendors, right? I've got too many vendors, so I'm going to consolidate it. I only want to work with a certain amount. And so if you can be that vendor who is doing the consolidation, right, winning deals on that. And then user experience is another thing we're hearing a lot about, right? And I think the big piece of this is, user experience was like a big trend when everybody got phones, right? It was like Airbnb and Uber gave you this great user experience, but that was on the consumer side. However, now people are expecting that same experience with their employer. So if I'm dealing with, the company that I work for, I no longer can have that web page that looks like it was built in 1995 that, and I have to go to 5 different places to get the same information. I need to have a single version where I can interact with my organization, right? And so employee experience, everything around that user experience, right? Still a lot of spending on that. Large transformation offerings are back in vogue. So we talked about Gen AI. I think this is really what's driving that, because what we've heard with Gen AI is, okay, the technology is amazing. It's transformative. Here's the problem. There's really 4 major bottlenecks. My data architecture is in no way ready to consume Gen AI. Right? If you think about most enterprise data environments, they're siloed, they're on different architectures. So Gen AI works great in a sandbox, but getting my data to the point where it can be useful, there is a lot of spending that's going to happen to get enterprises ready to do that. Right? Other bottlenecks, the risk of using Gen AI. If you talk to a CIO about putting an LLM that's trained using their data, put it into production, I mean, that's nightmare fuel, right? It's like there's potential data leakage. You talk to a compliance officer about where the data is residing. There's all kinds of stuff that is unresolved. So the risk and compliance piece, that's another bottleneck. That's the second. Third is the cost of electricity. General purpose models like a ChatGPT, they are extremely intensive in terms of power, the cost of power. Like a lot of people thought it was compute that was going to be the bottleneck, but it's actually the cost of power itself that's really the big bottleneck. And so a lot of firms are actually going to train their own LLMs, right, as a way to get away with that increase in power. But that's one of the bottlenecks, right, is can we actually train our own LLMs? And then lastly, training, right? Do we have the people, the data to actually train people on Gen AI to be able to use it, right? So those are the big bottlenecks. And so helping organizations across those bottlenecks, those are places where large transformational offerings are really coming back. Right, because everyone sees how transformative Gen AI is going to be, but there's those bottlenecks, right, that you have to be able to take advantage of. Digital product and R&D engineering are having a moment. So just thought this was interesting. You saw Infosys made a large acquisition for Intech, which is an R&D provider, and Cognizant acquired Belcan, which is another engineering R&D provider. So, this is sort of taking that outsourcing model that we've seen happen to the finance department, to the marketing department, to the HR department, and moving it to the R&D department. So if Mercedes-Benz needs to outsource the development of a car, or if Airbus needs to outsource development of an airplane wing, right? Outsourcing that, even some small component of it can be done offshore. That's a huge trend that is still really kind of driving growth. And we've seen a lot of the vendors really invest in having those hardcore R&D skills. Utilization is really high. So a lot of IT services firms have actually not made the layoffs that a lot of the software and hardware firms have. And instead, what they've done is they've let attrition really reduce their headcounts. But what does that mean? It means that they're actually, the utilization, which is the amount of time that people are doing billable work, has gone way up, and it's at almost all-time highs, which means it's good, right? Because that's why you have margin has been expanding, increased margin, right? We're not hiring as many people, we're getting more out of the people we have. But there's only so long you can really reduce hiring people like that before you start to get burnout, you start to get clients start to see delivery problems because you're working your people too hard. So this is kind of a short-term fix. Ultimately, we're going to see the market come back to growth to really kind of see long-term expansion of margin and need to see utilization come down. And then the last thing, just long-term outlook is still strong, right? We saw that growth curve. We're still going to return to above 4% growth. Gen AI, that is going to be a huge demand for IT services vendors because they're the ones that are going to fix the data environments, right? You can have the best data algorithm in the world, the best Gen AI algorithm in the world. If you don't have the actual data to supply it, right? It's garbage in, garbage out. So I think IT services firms are the ones who are really going to be able to take advantage of that. And there's a lot of spending. I mean, Julie Sweet from Accenture talks about this a lot. She says, I apologize to use an American analogy, but she says we're in the third inning of this. So if you know baseball, right, there's 9 innings. We're in the third, maybe the 4th inning, but there is still a lot of this game left to be played. And if you look at a lot of enterprises, you look at their data environment, their cloud environment, there is still so much spending that is left to be there. So it's still strong in terms of the long-term outlook, but there's this kind of pullback in discretionary spending. So wanted to just kind of share those with kind of the major trends. I know Rory, I'm kind of curious if that kind of resonates. I know you follow the market very closely, so if there's anything else that resonates or you'd like to add. I think you're on mute, Rory.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
I guess being aware of the time, I would say, yeah, I don't disagree with anything there. Duncan, I don't know if there's anything we haven't covered.
I mean, there's a lot we haven't. There's a lot we haven't covered. And I kind of feel like there's a much wider discussion about whether or not there is a market for truth in industry analysis. But I think in the time that we have available, actually, I would love it if you and Chad can just tell people how they can get in touch with you if they want to develop this conversation, or if they've got other kind of market forecasting, market sizing, understanding the market needs where either of you might be able to help.
Fine. So I'll go first. So Rory at quicktechtake.com. Quicktechtake.com has my details on there with some of her research. I'm also on LinkedIn. Don't just choose the first Rory Duncan that comes up, because there's a guy at Sheffield Hallam University who's a professor of biomedicine, I think, who will be very annoyed because he keeps getting stuff sent to him. And have a chat if you like. I'm in the UK for time zone. So Chad.
Yeah. So my email is chad@betterwayresearch.com. You can go to my website, betterwayresearch.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I think I don't know if there's a Chad Huston before me or not, but you should be able to find Chad Huston with me on LinkedIn. But would love to have a conversation. If you ultimately want to have that audited financial statement view of what the market is actually looking at, because again, my argument is this is some of the most important data that your organization should have. This is that dashboard, right? The same way a pilot needs to have that information, your CEO needs to have this information in front of them, and it needs to be the most up-to-date as possible. And so even if it's not me necessarily providing it, I would love to have conversations with people about how you can get to that best point of view, because this is a passion of mine and I'm about the methodology of how we get there. So yeah.
Chad, thank you so much. It's something that we're all passionate about. It's definitely a niche interest. Many people are interested more interested in like Panglossian dreams of of rapid growth rather than the truth. This recording will be on my YouTube channel in a little while. Please get in touch with us if you've got other questions, other comments. There's a lot more that we can get into on the conversation. So if there are angles that you'd like to hear, us or other people talking about, then let us know. It's definitely really insightful, a really interesting discussion. Thank you so much for all the feedback in the chat and on the questions that we've been getting. We look forward to speaking to you very soon. Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.